What if I told you that you were only a few steps away from successfully creating and sustaining a strong sourdough starter? I have a few tips that I'd like to share with you today that I believe will help you get started on the right foot. Before I really jump into this, I want to go ahead and let you guys know, since my discard jar is really full now, I'm actually going to discard my starter into this bowl to make a sourdough loaf from it. Anyway, let me jump into these pro tips. I don't actually have a lot of time. I have to go to an appointment soon, so I'm gonna try to keep this brief yet informative. Okay, so number one, the first thing I wanna focus on is the quality of your ingredients. You wanna make sure that, oh, actually I need to pause and grab some water. I just realized I forgot to get some. Okay, I have my water now. Okay, so you wanna make sure that you focus on using quality ingredients. And when I say quality, I know that can be a relative term, but the simplest way of looking at it is that your water, you want to make sure that preferably it's not chlorinated. If you have access to just tap water, you don't have a filter or anything in your house, that's totally fine. Just take some water, put it in a jar or even in a bowl, and just set it out in your kitchen. You may want to lightly cover it with a cloth or something just to make sure nothing gets into the water, but after about, so in some cases I've noticed within like 4 hours, I no longer smell the chlorine in the water. But if you want to play it safe and wait about 24 hours, your water will be safe. That's in case you don't have access to filtered water. You don't have to go so far as to buy like spring water or distilled water or anything like that from the store. I say just, unless your water is heavily contaminated, I recommend just either using a simple filter like a Brita filter, if you have a Berkey filter, or if you want to use this method of just leaving your water to set out at room temperature for about 24 hours, that would be more than enough time. The other key ingredient for your starter, of course, is the flour. I don't recommend that you necessarily jump in and throw a bunch of money into some organic, expensive flour necessarily. You can if you want, do what you want, but I 100% advocate for using unbleached flour. You want to use flours that if you buy it in the package, like a 5-pound bag of it, you turn it over and it tells you that it contains wheat or it contains flour, like wheat. Like it should not contain a bunch of other stuff, in my opinion, especially when you're starting out. Now, I do recommend using either whole wheat flour to start, or if you can get a hold of some rye flour, that's also helpful, simply because those flours I have found have been the most successful. I've found myself to be most successful using those flours when creating a starter. I don't necessarily use wheat flour, like whole wheat flour or rye flour, in the loaves of bread that I prepare, but they're just really great for creating a strong and sustaining a strong starter. Probably sometime next week, I will show you guys a bit of what I do to transition from having a starter that's, in this case, 100% whole wheat, to one that is more akin to the flour that I actually use when making my sourdough loaves. So those are the two key ingredients. You want to make sure that you can get the best quality that you can afford, that you're comfortable using, and that will help get you started on the right foot. That's number one. Number two, I 100% advocate for using tools that are as clean as possible. Now, this is, it's pretty straightforward and self-explanatory. I know this may not appear to be, this is kind of crusty looking on the top here, and that's actually completely normal to see when you have a starter. I could take the time every single time that I am feeding the starter to just wipe the rim and clean it off each time. I generally don't have time to do that. You can, if you'd like, just to make it look a little bit neater. Another recommendation is, as it relates to tools like this vessel, this mason jar, as you can see, it curves. It curves up and then up. If you are able to get a hold of a perfectly round container, like I believe there's a brand called Weck that has these glass containers that are just perfectly cylindrical. They go just straight up and down and they have a flat bottom. Those can be very, very easy to clean, and you don't have to deal with like the curves inside of the vessel whenever you're cleaning it out or feeding it and stirring it up. So that's basically number 2. You want to just make sure that the items that you're using are clean. One other side note that I want to throw in here is I mentioned in an earlier video that I transitioned from using like a cloth covering to cover my starter to using just a lid. This is just a plastic lid that I have. I bought like a set of them on Amazon for all my mason jars. And I just set it on top of my starter jar every day. This allows for there to be airflow, but then also keeps any possible contaminants out of it. One thing you will know, this is I guess a second side note, especially if you live in a warm climate or whenever it's like a warm time of year wherever you live, fruit flies love sourdough starter. And you definitely want to make sure that when you cover this, that you're just making sure that it's actually covered. Like you, for example, you don't want to cover it so that it's like that. That's not going to help you. You just want to make sure it's lightly over the jar, the opening of the jar, and that will be enough for all those wonderful microbes, the yeast and the bacteria, to get in there and do what it needs to do. Okay, that's number 2. Number 3 is the importance of using a scale. I'm not going to linger on this too much. I know that there are some people out there who really advocate for doing whatever floats your boat, whatever works for you. They have, they've figured out whatever measurements they like to use for cups or like teaspoons or quarter cups or whatever. This is the best way, and I don't believe this is an opinion. This is the best way to be consistent in the volume of just the flour and water that you're using to feed your starter, as well as the volume of starter that you're working with every time that you're discarding, every time you're using it in a recipe. The scale, I believe these numbers. I trust these numbers. I don't necessarily trust a measuring cup. This isn't a measuring cup, but I don't trust a measuring cup in which, there could be pockets of air within a quarter cup of flour, or clumps even possibly of flour if there's too much humidity in the air. Like, this is a really key component of being consistent and successful with your sourdough starter. I'm gonna leave it at that. Okay, number 4. So I do have to look at my notes here because I did jot something down here. And I kind of touched on this a little bit, but when it comes to using something to cover your jar, for example, and the topic right here is just like, I guess you could say hygiene maybe, but you just want to make sure not only that your tools are clean, but also that you're being consistent with even just your workspace, to make sure that you don't have other things around that could contribute to mold getting into your starter. So for example, I've heard, and I can understand a bit of this rationale, but if you like to do kefir or kefir, however you choose to pronounce it, or other fermented items, if you like to have fermented items in your kitchen, it's a good idea to kind of keep them separated. I don't know what distance, I don't know, 5 feet, 10 feet, whatever, but I can understand the importance of doing that, because if for some reason you have like your starter and then you have like some cabbage that you're fermenting to make a, I don't know why I'm blanking on the word, sauerkraut, and then you have another jar over here with your kombucha, and they're just like right here, and then one of them somehow gets contaminated, that contamination can very easily jump to whatever the next thing, whatever's nearby. I just think it's a really good idea. And even if you don't have other things fermenting in your kitchen, just in general, make sure that your workspaces are kept clean. I wouldn't go so far as to like what I would consider over sterilizing things, like, because there is such a thing as good bacteria, and we do want the good bacteria to be in our starter, in our sourdough bread, in our food. And I guess one key way of looking at this is, obviously you want to make sure you wash your hands with warm water and soap before you start doing any of this, which I've done. And I'm probably going to wash my hands again before I actually do this, because I have been scratching my nose. It's a bit itchy right now. So you want to make sure that your hands are clean, but don't be afraid to use your hands when you're in the process of mixing your sourdough, your sourdough starter, when you're making your sourdough bread. It's really important that the biology that's a part of your body is also a part of your food and vice versa. This is how we help maintain our microbiome in a healthy way. I'm not going to dive too deep into that either. I'm trying to keep this kind of brief, but I guess this is just a hint as to some future content that'll be coming your way. All right, we'll dive into that more deeply at another time. Now, the fifth pro tip I want to share with you right now is temperature. Temperature, you want to make sure that the water that you're using, for example, when you are creating your starter, you don't want it to necessarily be freezing cold. Like, I would recommend, if you can get it at room temperature, which I know can be relative, but if it can be anywhere between, let's say, 68 degrees Fahrenheit and 75 or 78 degrees Fahrenheit, I think that's a good range. Same with the flour. Sometimes people choose to freeze their flour, and that can come in handy when you do something like freshly mill your own flour. But again, I would recommend, if you can, get your flour to room temperature before you actually create your starter. And this is in part because the ideal temperature environment for your yeast and your bacteria to grow in is about 70 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, or approximately, I think it's 21 to 25 degrees Celsius. So my recommendation, again, is if you can maintain your ingredients as well as your starter within that range, you're more likely to have success. If it's too warm, if you're up in like the upper 70s or lower 80s in temperature, your yeast and bacteria will survive at those temperatures. They'll be okay, but understand that they're going to be super active. Like, they will be much more active more quickly, which can be good or bad, especially once you transition into that phase of making your own sourdough bread. But you definitely don't want your water or anything like that to be above like 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Like, it's just way too hot. You're very likely to kill off a lot of the great yeast and bacteria that you've worked so hard to build into this sourdough starter. I will see you all again soon. One thing I also want to point out here is that when I feed my starter, I always add water first. Let's say I want to pour 50 grams of water into the jar, but I accidentally pour 52 grams. It's much easier for me to go ahead and say, all right, I'll pour 52 grams of flour. And then the other side of that too is that because the flour is added second, I can add I can also take away excess flour a lot easier because it's so much lighter and will sit on top of the water as I'm adding it. It's much easier for me to remove excess flour versus trying to remove any excess water.